Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. I added 2 recommendations for vendor validations to add to your vendor setup and maintenance process for 2025. See which ones they are and where to validate. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 322. 2 more recommended validations for 2025 and where to validate. So many of you may already know that I have a authentication validation management 3-step vendor setup and maintenance process e-guide that I come up or I update every year. Now, this authentication validation management, it is that 3-step process for setting up your vendors to avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. Really, it's vendor setup and maintenance. And it's a framework that includes 5 authentication techniques, 29 internal controls, 17 best practices, and now 18 vendor validations. And every year I update it with something. I think in 2024, I added 2 internal controls. But for 2025, I added 2 more vendor validations. And I'm always updating this because, right, regulatory requirements change. Also, additional validation resources are added. And of course, fraudsters always evolve. So I'm either adding authentication techniques, internal controls, best practices, vendor validations every year, or I'm also adding additional resources for you to do those validations. But for 2025, I added 2 vendor validations. Now, I will link in the show notes where you can go and get all 5 authentication techniques, all 29 internal controls, all 17 best practices, and all 18 vendor validations in the e-guide or on the workshop. There's a 4-hour live training that I do the 4th Wednesday of every month. Or you can watch the recording. And if you do that and you pass an exam, then you will become a vendor process specialist. You'll get that certificate. So you can either get the e-guide, and it's no fluff in there, by the way. It's like 78 pages and it's all bullet points and action items, or you can walk through it in that 4-hour workshop. So I'm going to link both in the show notes. But for now, I'm just going to go over the 2 new vendor validations that I recommend. Now, the first one, you might think, what the heck is that? And this is one that actually, depending on your resource that you use for your vendor validations, may already be a part of it. but it is the PEP list, or the politically exposed persons or foreign persons list. And a politically exposed person is someone who has been determined to be more susceptible to being involved in bribery or corruption based on their position or their influence. Now, the reason why I added it as recommended is because doing business with the vendors on that are considered politically exposed persons can be viewed as a form of bribery and corruption. Now, that might not be something that you may be interested in, but your risk management team may. And depending on the country, there may be additional due diligence required for some of the leaders, right, at your vendors' places of business. So, depending on the country, they may have to do additional due diligence. And by they, I mean your risk management team or whoever handles that at your company may have to do additional due diligence, for example, on the CEO or the CFO. Now, where do you perform this validation? Well, the good news is that if you have 10check.com, which you've heard me recommend them so many times because it combines the IRS 10 match with so many other vendor validations, including the Social Security Death Master File check. If you have an individual and you enter in a social security number, that can let you know if your vendor is perpetrating identity theft because they're using a deceased person's social security number. So that's great. Also, if you didn't know that the vendor may be a tax exempt organization, it can let you know that. And then there are 42 different watch lists as well. And guess what? The politically exposed persons, or PEP list, is a part of that. So that is one place that you can go. And I do recommend either 10check or another service like that, where they provide multiple validations with just one check or one resource. That way, you don't have to go to multiple different sites in order to do your vendor validations, right? It's just one check. So I'll put the link to to 10check.com. That's all it really is, 10check.com, in the show notes. And I don't have any affiliate relationship with them. I just use them as a practitioner, and now I still use them as a consultant when I clean up vendor master files. Now, why am I recommending them now? Well, what I have found is that many teams, accounts payable teams, vendor teams, will say they don't have international vendors. However, when I work with them to do customized vendor validations or cleaning their vendor master file, I always find non-US or international vendors. And who knows, those vendors may be or need additional due diligence. And this is one way or one indicator that you may need some additional due diligence for your vendors. All right, so that's the first one. Now, the second one is something that many of you may have already been doing. And it is, I will tell you, very manual, and that is searching the Secretary of State records. Now, what this does is it confirms the business registration information, including the legal name, tax ID, and address, because that should all be on the Secretary of State registration. And what it really does that I like it for is it ties an address to the vendor. And what I've been finding is that some accounts payable teams, vendor teams, procurement teams, whoever has the ownership over the vendor master file and the vendor setup and maintenance process, they will go on Google and they will Google that vendor and verify that the vendor's address comes up. But what we know from fraudsters is that they now have taken over, right? What the results are coming from a regular Google search. They know they have the money to invest in SEO, they have the money to invest in ads, anything to get their site, their information to come up to the top. And so, what you really want to do is verify the vendor's information against public records, not just Google. That's another reason why, for example, you really shouldn't use Google to find a vendor website because it could be spoofed, and you might think you're going to the website to get impartial data for or real data for the AR team in order to confirm your vendor's banking, but that may not be the best option. It's the same thing with the address, and so Secretary of State records is good for that. And I do have a couple of different resources for you. So the first one is Secretary of State business entity search, the Secretary of State pages for every state in the US. I do have a link to both on my vendor process training center. You do have to register in order to access it, but it's free. You can create a free account and you'll have access to other free resources as well, including content for tax reporting, 1099s, 1042s, also links to vendor validation resources as well. And you can even download a PDF of those. And so that and a whole bunch of other things as well, including like vendor process FAQs. So I will put a link to the Vendor Process Training Center so you can create your account and get access to it. The other place that I have, or the other resource that I have for you related to Secretary of States is, sometimes you have an address for a vendor, but that vendor is in a state different than where the vendor registered. Because, Delaware, for whatever reason, and I knew it at one point, there are a lot of companies that are registered in Delaware, but that's not where they are, or that's not the address that they provide to you. And so you may not know, or they may not be registered in the state of the address that they give you. And so, how do you know where they are registered so that you can go and check? Well, I am a certified fraud examiner. I know if you've listened to other of my podcasts, you probably know that. But I also go to our local chapter meetings. It really has a lot of great information. You get to network, they're in person, and the topics can be very interesting. And so January 2025, this month's topic was on due diligence. And one of the resources actually helps me now with this very issue, and it can help you too. And it's called Open Corporates, opencorporates.com, all one word. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. And if you go there and you put your vendor's name in, they will tell you every state that they are registered in. They are also good to bring up an address as well. And I like that. This is a little bonus. I like that because if you get, let's say, a change of address from your vendor, you can go into Open Corporates and see if that address comes up. Now, I did the exact same thing for NACHA. I don't know how long it takes for the information to be updated. So if it doesn't come up, I wouldn't discount it. It just might be a red flag if you have other red flags with that address change. But as an example, NACHA has sent out an information email saying our office is moved. Now, they did move August 1st, 2024, but when I went on Open Corporates and put in NACHA as the business name, their new address came up, as did the states that they were registered in. So that can be just another option for you to validate changed information or to get the states that they are the state or states that your vendor is registered in so that you can go to that page and verify their information. All right, so that is it for today. Two new vendor validations, the politically exposed persons list, and then also the Secretary of State business registration. So, thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 322nd episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.